Look it. Look at my shirt. My shirt. It's my favorite shirt, and I look like I'm totally sunburned, but I promise I'm not. That's just the light. What is going on, everyone? My name is Under the Radar, and welcome back to the Draft League Viabilities. This is the start of the Ubers, or the OP, or the mons that could be banned in some leagues portion of this series. Now, as I said before, this is probably going to be the most controversial area of it because people are going to think that these mons are broken. I may have different opinions. Just remember, you respect my opinion, I'll respect yours, and we'll all get along great unless you're shoddy, and then, you just kind of have to live with them. This week we're going to be going with two of them that I think are my two favorite ones that I'm going to be covering in this entire OP portion of this series, and that's just because I'm not sure how I feel about them. Like, I'm on the fence, and I just cannot decide no matter how hard I try. First mon this week that we're going to be covering is Kyurem Black. Now, Kyurem Black is a very unique Pokemon because it just hits really, really hard. And I think the reason why a lot of people think that this is a broken Pokemon in draft format for the most part is because you cannot check this thing defensively. Other threats in the league format you can almost always check with defense in some shape, way, or form. Like Nidoking, it's one of the hardest wall breakers to switch into in the format. You have things like Assault Vested Spadef Mons that can take hits pretty well, but then it runs physical and then it can run through you anyway. You have things like Mega Char X, which are just probably some of the best setup sweepers, which if you don't have a way of thunder waving it or anything like that with Prankster, and it gets up to like a Swords Dance, a Belly Drum, or a Dragon Dance, you are screwed and you are going to be losing a lot of mons to this one sweeper. The same goes for mons like Mega Scizor, Excadrill, all these other crazy offensive mons, Manaphy, Mew if it sets up a nasty plot and has Vacuum Wave, or Swords Dance, Sucker Punch. You get what I'm saying. To take on certain threats like that, people try to check them defensively. It doesn't work for every single team because not everybody's going to have a check to these mons. So the way people check them is check them offensively. The reason why people think this thing is broken is because the only way you can check it is to check it offensively. You have to figure out its set, you have to figure out whether it's Life Orb or Scarf or Banded or Specs or Assault Vest or Sub Roost or whatever. You have to figure out its set and then deal with it. The thing is, with this thing, if you can figure out its spread, like say you know it's Choice Scarfed, you switch in your Bulky Water on it while it's going for an Ice Beam, you know it's Choice Scarfed if they switch out, because otherwise they would go for Fusion Bolt, and normally Fusion Bolt from Mixed Kyurem does a lot to Bulky Waters. While this thing is very hard to switch into in some instances, this thing runs 5 moves. About. 5 offensive moves. About. You have Ice Beam, you have Outrage / Dragon Claw, you have Draco Meteor, you have Ice Beam, you have Earth Power. If your opponent has a really bulky steel type like Ferrothorn, you could run Hidden Power Fire. So 5 to 6 moves about. Then you add in things like Sub and Roost, and then that's about all this thing does really well, is it just hits hard. So if you have a very good mon to check its main way of offense, it leaves one move that it can hit you with, which means if it's choiced, it cannot hit you. So there's a part of me that says, since this thing only has certain moves, well, realistically certain moves, granted it could also run things like Iron Head for fairies, it could run Flash Cannon, it could run like Zen Headbutt and things of that nature. They're situational because 9 times out of 10, things like Dragon Claw or Outrage from base 170 are still going to hit just as hard to some of those like bulky dark types, which there aren't many. I don't know what I'm saying. Like bulky, I used a really stupid example with dragon type moves, but Iron Head for fairies, like you have Ice Beam if it's a physically defensive fairy, you have Earth Power, you have other things that can hit it. So yeah, it can run certain moves to hit other things super effectively, but it's like you can figure out what moves it's going to have to run every single week. When I was using in the NPCC, my opponent could basically look at their team and be like, okay, I have a Sylveon, so Kyurem Black is going to be running Iron Head. I have a pretty bulky water type in something like Milotic or Empoleon or something like that. So it's going to have Fusion Bolt. It's 2 of its moves down already. It doesn't have physical Ice Stab, so it's going to be running Ice Beam if it wants to run anything, which means it's going to have to run a minus defensive nature of some sort, unless you're a man and you want to run like Jolly and still minus it if you can get the damage off with it. And then a filler move. That filler move is normally something that doesn't come into play too much because this thing is just so hard with its stabs, it doesn't really matter. So here's my dilemma with this thing. Yeah, it hits hard, but it's base 95 speed. That means that if you have a base 100 Mon, it's weak to a lot of very common, hard-hitting moves. Close Combat for one, Outrage for another, Stone Edge for a third. All three of them hit so stupid hard. And if you want to talk special, you have Mega Gardevoir, which can hit it with Hyper Voice. You have Sylveon, which can live in Iron Head, even if it is like Choice Banded if you're max Fizz Def. I'm pretty sure you can live one. Kill it with a Hyper Voice if you don't die to it. You have things like Whimsicott with Moonblast. You have all these other... You have Focus Blast for those fairies that want to hit on the special side. And then it's also weak to common priority in Mach Punch and Bullet Punch. Here's my thing. It's bulky. Yes, it has like... Hold on, I actually need to get up its exact stats. It has base 125 in HP, 100 in defense, and 90 in speed def. With it being naturally weak to Stealth Rocks, taking 25%, being weak to common priority, being able to be outsped by common Scarfers, and being able to hit very hard by things like Stone Edge, this makes it very easy to check this thing offensively. If you look at it that way, this is the Darmanitan of Ice Dragon types. This is the Emboar of Ice Dragon types. You cannot check this thing defensively. As being a bulky... Well... used to be a bulky player after this season of PPL. I'm not going to call myself that shit anymore. As liking bulky Mons, it does hurt me and it makes me want to say, damn, this thing might be broken. But whenever you look at it as there are so many things that can just hit it really fucking hard. Bulky steel types, for one, can take it on pretty well because the best thing it can do to hit them is Hidden Power and Earth Power. Things like Shukaberry, things like Magnet Rise, things like, I'm sorry, I just completely drew a brain fart. Things like Assault Vest, they make it so it can take on these moves pretty well. Then it's weak to Iron Head, it's weak to Flash Cannon. A lot of steel types get Thunder Wave, aside from Scizor, but I mean like Cobalion, things of that nature. So they can live a hit, Thunder Wave it, and then it's easy to revenge kill. They can kill it with a Close Combat, Iron Head. This thing is easily checked offensively. The problem is, if you are on a team that is built very well, and your opponent, well, if you are using Kyurem Black and your team is built very well to where you can get a kill every single time you drop this thing in, switch it out, sack something off, drop it back in, get another kill, you will end up winning the game just because your opponent cannot play around it correctly. So using this Mon then comes all onto your opponent's prep. Isn't that what Draft League is about? So that's my reasoning for why it should be allowed in every single Draft League. Along with the fact that I've seen like 2 people use this thing actually decently well to where it wasn't negative and differential. I used it pretty well in the MPCC. I believe I had it go like 10 and 4, something like that. It did really freaking well. That's just because I had a stupid good team and I could drop it in and get a kill. Switch out, sack them, drop it in, get a kill. That's the way this thing has to be built around, is just, it has to be your main revenge killer. While some people have things like a Mega Medicham, Mega Sceptile, a Mega Manectric, all these other really good revenge killers, a Darmanitan. This thing can be a really good revenge killer, and if your opponent doesn't have a good steel type, it could be a very good wall breaker. It just depends on your opponent's team. Reasons why I think it should not be allowed. It has base 170 attack. Ow. That hurts. But it only has one stab that it can run, and that's Dragon Claw or Outrage. You want to run Dragon Claw because if you're in Outrage, your opponent's going to have a fairy, can switch it in and easily kill it after that. So realistically, you are limited to just Dragon Claw with it. So that ends up turning into a reason why it should be allowed. But then you look at things like Sturdy, things like Levitate, all these other really cool abilities that can work super well for a team and for a mon specifically to help you get a sweep. Kyurem Black just doesn't give a shit about him. Just absolutely does not care at all. Because it has Terravolt, which is basically Mold Breaker. But realistically, this thing, if I were to put this thing in the GBA style of drafting, which I'm like 95% positive that the GBA allows it. I don't see why they wouldn't. It would be A tier. PPL, it would be right up there with things like Victini, in my opinion. You would have to pay a lot of money for it because it's just very expensive. Things like the GPC, I would do the exact same thing. TBU, I would do the exact same thing. Just make it high tier. That's all that you have to do for this mon, is make it high tier, make it so it limits the rest of your team and what you can do with it, and then you're good. When you are drafting in a draft style league to where you can draft whatever the fuck you want around this thing. Say you can draft Mega Sableye. You draft a Landorus Eye, you can draft a Greninja with Protean, but it only has XY movesets. And then you can draft something like a Ferrothorn, you can draft a Clefable. This thing instantly becomes broken. Like, that's the way this Pokemon works. It's all based on your team. So if you can limit how well your team is built with it, I think that the Pokemon success itself will be limited. Oh, PPL drafting style, do I think it's broken? No. I think it's very fucking good. I think it's very scary. Whenever you see it on your opponent's team, that's something that you're probably going to prep for the most. But you have things like Manaphy, Victini, Darmanitan, Excadrill, Megaladios. Of all these mons that looking at it, you're just like, holy shit, you have Hydreigon. You have all these mons that are just so scary to look at. So this thing is not much different. If you want to compare this thing to a Hydreigon, Hydreigon has significantly weaker stats in its offensive capabilities. Special attack is pretty good compared to, like, whenever you're comparing Kyurem Black and Hydreigon, but its physical attack is not. That I realize, so bulky waters are a little bit more of a problem for this thing, but the coverage that Hydreigon gets is 110 times better than anything that Kyurem Black could ever dream of getting. It gets stab with both. It gets physical stab with both. It gets access to Earth Power, Flash Cannon, gets access to Head Smash, gets access to, I don't think I already said Flamethrower, Earth Power. It gets access to all these cool moves that you can use to go around. It gets access to Taunt. It gets access to U-Turn. It has a faster speed tier. So there are so many things that make Hydreigon more threatening to a team because it's harder to check offensively if it's Scarfed. It's harder to switch into in general because it has 2 stabs. So whenever you look at it like, okay, so I want to run a physical Kyurem Black, but I have to run Ice Beam as my stab, it's going to be significantly weaker compared to I want to run Dragon Pulse and Dark Pulse on my Hydreigon. This mon overall, going through this video, I think I kind of formed my opinion about it as to whether I think it's broken or not, and ultimately I'm going to say no, it's not. I think it should be allowed in league format basically everywhere. It's just a mon that you have to check offensively. You cannot check it defensively. That makes it not broken. That makes it a very good offensive, I'm going to call it offensive breaker, because it's not really that much of a wall breaker, because certain walls can stand up to it. You just have to build properly around it, and I think that's where a lot of people fault this thing. So going into how, I'm not going to really say how you could build around it because it's an offensive mon. It's kind of just like, I need to build a good core, like a Dragon Fairy Steel core. I need to have a really good Fairy and a really good Steel type. Preferably one that switches into Kyurem, so that way your opponent doesn't have it. So something like a Registeel is something I would take because it gets Thunder Wave, it gets Stealth Rocks, it gets things to weaken things for Kyurem to just punch through walls a little bit better. And then I would go with something like Clefable or Sylveon, something that would originally be a check to this thing if it could, and this could also deter other setup sweepers that might want to be able to threaten out Kyurem and then set up in its face. For example, like a Dragonite, if you want to run like, for example, like a Salamence. If you have a Salamence in, it scares out Kyurem Black instantly, but then you have Unaware Clef in the back, and that kind of neuters the whole sweeping of Dragon Dance Salamence. So that's kind of the Fairy Steel Dragon core I would build with this thing. It's just an offensive mon that's really good. Overall, though, I'm going to give it an A- because I would much rather have a Hydreigon. I would much rather have a Salamence. I would much rather have any other dragon type than Kyurem Black. That's just my personal opinion, because I like dragon types that have really good move coverage, that have a little bit better of a speed tier, because base 95 It speed ties with a lot of other Scarfers, and it's easily outsped by a lot of things. I would rather have Salamence over every other dragon type in the entire game, in my opinion, and that is just how I feel about it. But again, this is not something to check defensively. It's not possible. And if you go into a game looking at Kyurem Black and being like, hey, I can check this thing defensively pretty well, you're one of the few, and it won't happen every single season that you go up against this thing. It's just a really powerful offensive mon. That's going to basically be my analysis on Kyurem Black. I realize that a lot of people might think differently than me. However, I personally do not think it's broken. I think it should be allowed in League format. I think it's pretty good offensively, but in things like the Token Minorities tournament, when you only had 7 mons, that's a little iffy because there are so few things that you can actually pick and draft from, and everybody goes like pure offense, and it's a little bit harder to find ways to deal with it. So I think there it's a little bit more understandable why it was banned there. Things like the PPL, the GPC, the TBU, GBA. I said the TBU. I just turned into one of those guys. Things like TBU, they can all be allowed. Kyurem Black, it's just an offensive mon. Like, realistically, it's just a really good offensive mon. And if you feel differently, that's fine. Let me know your guys' opinion in the comment section down below, because I always love reading your guys' opinions, why you think something is too powerful, why you think it's good or bad or whatnot. I always love reading my comment section on this series. But I hope you guys did enjoy. If you did, make sure to leave a like along with a comment. I'm going to go ahead and get out of here. I hope you guys have an absolutely fantastic day, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.